Hi folks. In preparation for this week's homework, what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time and explore some topics with you. So the first things we're going to look at will be a list and a ComboBox control, which is on the toolbar on the left-hand side. I'd like to understand those a little bit. And then we're going to go back in and re-review list arrays. And we're going to take a look at the relationship between a list array and these list and ComboBox controls. And at the end, we're going to close out. We're going to talk a little bit about the ForEach loop. We know that the for next loop has a starting and an ending point specific, but we're going to find out that this ForEach loop is going to do things similar but different. So to get started here, I'm going to go ahead, grab my form, and I'm going to set my basic font again to 14 so you folks can see a little bit better what I'm working on here. So set it at 14. Okay. First two things is we're going to pull a ComboBox onto the form here, and we're going to pull a list control or a ListBox onto the form. And let's explore these a little bit and understand them. Basically, these are very similar type controls. The difference is that in a ComboBox control, I have a list of items, and I can pick one item out of that list. And only one item shows up in that combo box once it's selected. The list box is different. I can make the list box as high as I want, and how high the list box is, depending upon the font, is how many elements will show up or how many items in that list will show up within that this list box itself. Also, whereas one item can be selected within the combo box, we'll find out that I can use my control button and select multiple different items within this ListBox control. Now, before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about inheritance and when these controls that were created right here. You remember we talked before, and we've experienced this as well. We've said that objects are made up of other objects. This form right here is an example. I've got an object, a form object, and inside here I'm going to be utilizing different controls, but when I compile it, I'm essentially coming up with one executable object at the very end that is made up of other objects. And let's take a look at another example here. They got a thing out here called a DateTime Picker, just to show you what I'm talking about. And this DateTime Picker, it has got a lot of power to it. Let me change it around a little bit because right now it's showing the date in a long format. The advantage of this DateTime Picker, without going into depth on it though, is that I can format this DateTime Picker. So let me see here, to a short date, something like that. And it's made up of a couple of different controls. This one control is made up of a couple. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let me run this. And the DateTime control, as it's compiling, is a wonderful control because in the old days, if I had to put a date into a computer program, I would have to go back in and test that date for its validity. To keep somebody from putting in, for example, a February 30th date, this control right here will prevent that from happening. What it does is it comes back in and it only allows me to select individual dates that exist. Boy, and it's sure taken a long time to compile this program here that should have done pretty much immediately. Okay, but the advantage here with this control is that I can pick any date. I'm using my arrow keys right now to pick. I can jump back and forth and pick, and it will only allow me to select a valid date. For example, if I went back here, and this is a non-leap year, so if I try to go up to 28 and now hit 29, it won't let me do 29. But if I move back over here and made this a 2016, now all of a sudden I can get to 29. So it only allows me to put valid dates in. But even better than that, and really the focus of this, is this little button over here. If I click this button right here, it brings up a calendar. Now, what it's showing me is this control, when it was created in combination with some other different controls. It looks to me like this might be a combo box or a text box that was modified a little bit. And at the same time, they added this calendar control. And let me show you what I'm talking about. If I look over here on my menu, let me see, do I have it here? Oh, I may not even have that item in here. There is a calendar control that exists, and I probably would have to load it, but it's that same element that when I ran this, it popped open that calendar. So I could have used that calendar. In fact, here it is right here. Right there. That's that same calendar. So this object was implemented with a combination of different controls together. And that's what I'm trying to get at here, because now let's come back and take a look at these two elements. Let's start off with by looking at this list box here. If I look at the list box and the properties available on the list box over here, you're going to see that it has a thing called items and it says collection here. And if I open this up, what it does is it gives me this textual area that I can type in values that I want to appear in that list box. So let's say I want to put dog, because my program is called critter, by the way. I want to put cat, horse, cow in here, and then go ahead and click OK. And notice that immediately those elements, except I misspelled cow, those elements were put into that combo box for me on my behalf. So let's go back to these guys and re-edit that and change cow. There we go. Now, if we come back over here to this guy as well and look, we'll see that he also has a items collection in here, and I could do the same thing in here. I could do dog, cat, horse, cow, and click OK. Now notice the difference is here immediately I can see those elements. Over here I can't. What dictates how many elements are visible here is the size of the object. So if I shorten it down, notice now that a scroll bar appears immediately to let me know I need to scroll up and down because there's multiple elements here. But nothing shows up here. Let's rerun this. There we go. Compiling's a little bit quicker. So notice I can pick any element over here. Okay. I can only pick one element at a time right now. So I'm holding the control key down. It's only letting me pick one element, and I'll show you why that is in a minute. But over here, when I hit the combo box down arrow, I can see all the elements. Oh, misspelled cow again. And that was a fat finger. But whatever I select now appears. So in these particular cases, these are the selected items right here. The selected items. Now, what I want to point out, and let me fix that cow. And by the way, you'll notice that when we select these objects, there's these little helper buttons that show up here. These are buttons that Microsoft has thrown in there to give us shortcuts to some of the common properties that we might see over here, one of which is the items. So I can edit the items, come back in and correct cow here if I want. Okay. Now, when I'm adding these items into these controls like I just did, I'm making those static items, which means they're hard-coded in. What if I want to have the ability to dynamically add elements into these guys, to dynamically add elements into them? Well, before we do that, what I want to do is I want to break away. I'm going to come back and look at my code here, and I want to review an object that we looked at once before, and that is that list item. We talked earlier about arrays, and remember I told you that an array is kind of like a locker, if you will, just a large locker that has lockers on top and bottom, and let's say that there's 10 lockers up and down. And we number the locker from the bottom as 0 and all the way up to locker number 9, which is at the very top, 0 through 9. So at any point I can refer to an element that's inside that locker as locker 4 or locker 3, and by doing that I'm talking about what's in that particular locker. Okay. And I can move things around in the lockers if I want to, but effectively the advantage is I've got one set of lockers that I can move around, and as I move those lockers around, all those individual lockers follow me with it. And the same thing holds true here. We have these elements that we call an array, and an array is basically like a variable that can hold multiple elements in it. So for years we used these arrays, but what ended up happening was Microsoft changed around and said, you know, arrays are excellent elements. They're across the board in most programming languages, in fact all programming languages that I've ever dealt with. But the problem with an array is sometimes they get hard to deal with. For example, if you want to add an item into the array, how do you know where to add it? If you've got 3 items in this array right now, 3 of those cabinets filled, how do you know? Do you have to go back in and look inside of each one to see is it empty before you put something in it? Or what if you want to sort those lockers in a different order, or you want to sort your array in a different order? In the old days, you would actually have to do a programmatic sort that says, look in the first locker, if you will. Look at the second locker. If the second locker is less than the first locker, flip them around. And you would do that top to bottom. It was very complicated. So what Microsoft did is they said, let's take these simple array type variables and let's create a new object. And that object, we're going to call it a list object. And in that list object, we're going to give it all the capabilities of an array, but we're also going to embed in it methods, features that in the past you had to do by hand, but nowadays we're going to give it an add method that will automatically look for the first open space and add an element in for us. We don't have to write that anymore. Or how about a search feature that if I'm trying to search something, then it would automatically know that it's going to increment itself and it's going to just come back and tell me where in my array or where in my lockers that particular item is located. Or the more complicated aspect, which is a sort. That sort feature. Let's add a sort feature in so the person doesn't have to go back in and write that complicated sort. And that's what a list is. So let's talk a little bit about how to create a list, because a list is made up of a data type. You have a list of strings, or you have a list of numbers, if you will, or you can even have a list of objects. And what we refer to those lists as are collections. So in the old days we called them an array of elements or array indices. Today we're going to say it's a collection. So an array is a collection of elements or a collection of integers or a collection of strings, if you will. So let's look at how, first of all, we might want to go back in there and create this array. So we start off with the keyword list. Okay, and then inside list we're going to give it in brackets, as you see here, the data type of the array that I want to create. So if I'm going to create an array of animal names as we did before, then what I'm going to do is come back in here and say I want a list of type string. Okay, and then afterwards I say a name. What do I want to call my list? I'm going to call mine a critter list. Any name I want to give it, okay, is equal to a new. Now, this is important to understand. We're going to see as we go along and when we instantiate objects, because remember, this is an object, we're going to have to do it a little bit different than what we did with a simple variable. Remember, with a variable, I just said int total or something like that. Here, I'm instantiating a string array, but what I want to do is I don't want to just set aside the memory for that string array. What I'm going to tell it to do, or excuse me, that list, I'm going to say when you create this new list of critter list, not only do I want you to set the memory aside, but I also want you to bring across all those methods that were pre-created for lists and make it so that I could use that inside critter list. So in order to do that, I instantiate that list just like this. And we're going to understand this a little bit more when you get into your advanced, the 256 class, which follows Introduction to Programming. But first of all, at this point now, I've got this list created. And inside this list, I can do something like critter list dot, and there's all kinds of different methods in here. Take a look. There's an add method, so I can add a new element to that critter list, and I don't have to look to find the very first available location. The add method will do that automatically for me. So this is so much nicer in here. Let's find some other ones that are in here. There's a clear, which wipes out your list entirely. It's like erasing everything. There's a contains that searches the list for something that you might want. So I might want to look to say, does my critter list contain dog? And it would come back and return back to me. It tells me right here, if you look at this, that it's a Boolean, and it's going to just tell me yes or no. Does it contain that as well? I can copy the list if I want to another list. I can count the number of items that exist within my critter list. Let's see. Here's another find me feature for me. So there's two different ways that we can find elements within that list. In this case, this one returns back, let's see, searches for an element that matches the conditions defined by the predicate and returns a list of those occurrences. So this find will return back if there's more than one element that matches that list, it's going to return back more than one element. So you see that there's a lot of powerful features inside here. Some of these overlap a little bit. Here's my remove. That's how I delete an item from my list. I can say remove at location 7, or I can say remove dog if I wanted to. So in this case, let's say I wanted to add a new item in here. Okay, so I do critter list dot add, there it is, and if I hit my left parenthesis, it says, what do you want to add? So I've got to be of type string, so here I'm going to add in dog. Okay, and I could just go through and repeat that process each time, just like this, and add in cat, and I'm adding it into this critter list. And if I run this guy, hold on, let's just prove what's happening here. Let's add another one in here, horse, and let's come back. So when the form loads, I'm adding these elements in. So what I want to do is come back here, let's delete this object out, and we're just going to focus right now on this combo box here. So what I want to do is get rid of all that stuff that I put in a minute ago. Let's get rid of all this, because that was added in here. I want to do this dynamically from within my code, the difference. If I know always I'm going to have a certain set of entries, certainly this is an easy way to do it. But if those entries are ever going to be dynamic and change, I don't want to do it this way. So let's prove how this is going to work. Let me come back, look at my code here. I'm going to put a stop right there. Right there. I'm going to stop my program as it's running. So this is going to happen as the form loads, immediately as the program runs. So let's take a look and see what happens. So now if I come back in here and I ask it, it's run through that. If I point now to critter list, look what it does. Oops. If I point to critter list, it tells me there's 3 items in critter list. And if I open it up, there's my dog, cat, and my horse, just like you see right there. So this is an example of the of that list object. But let's pause for a second. I want to come back and show you something. A minute ago I showed you that DateTime Control, and I showed you that it was made up of what appeared to be a text box or maybe even a combo box, but also that calendar control. Well, and that was something that you could see. You could look at that and see that it existed. But this guy right here also has something very similar. This, if we come down in here, this items collection right here is a collection. What it is, it's a list array that's embedded within this control right here. So what I can do is when I have right here immediately with this control, if I come back in, watch this. So I'm back in my code right here. What I want to do is I'm going to comment all of this out right here. Because if in fact, there's my comment. Let's take this stop out for right now. So if in fact that object has that control inside of it, that items, I should be able to get to it. Now watch this. So if I come back over and I do ComboBox 1, I didn't change the name of it. I probably should have, but I didn't. Right over here, and I do items. Right here, when I click items, notice over here, this is going to be a collection of items in that combo box. So check this out. Items dot, there's an add right there. So now, basically what I could do is I can do all of this. When I do boom right here. Paste this right here. And I'm doing exactly what I did with the list item, but I'm finding now that the list item was embedded within this combo box. So check this out now. Let's just go through the list here. Let me copy this guy. Something just like that. So let's do dog, cat, horse, and let's spell cow right this time. C-O-W, and I'm going to run it. So again, it says when this form is loading, it's going to add those items. Let's put a stop over here just so we can go back in and investigate. Although we really don't need a stop. Let me show you why. Let's run it. And now let's pull this combo box down, and there's the elements. Those guys right there came from that code, and I can prove it. Let's add in hamster. Just like that. Rerun it. Click it. And there's my hamster down below. So now notice how I'm adding these guys into this control though. I'm doing a literal here. I'm telling exactly what to put in now. But I don't have to use the literal. Check this out. Let's come back over here and throw a text box onto this form. And this is leading us into the homework. This is pretty close to what our homework is going to be. So watch carefully. So I'm going to grab a text box here. So with this text box on the screen, what I want to do is every time I type something into this text box and I leave the text box, I want whatever's put in this text box to be added to this combo box. And then I want to erase what's in that text box. So in order for that to work, I need to have, because I'm going to use a leave event for it. I think in your homework you're going to put it behind a button, but in my case I'm going to do it differently because I want you to think a little bit. So let's throw a button down here just to prove that it's going to work. Where's my buttons at? Right here. And I'm just going to have that be my exit button here. So let's just put exit on it. Button exit. And we'll put the word exit on it. And as long as I'm coding it, let's code that. Let's do a this.close. That will close the program out. So, and the reason I did that is because when I tab out of it, I have to have a place to go. And it would have tabbed up here, which is probably not the end of the world. But now, so for that to happen, I've decided in my program that my event handler that I want to code is when I leave that. So I'm going to go and find my leave event right here. There it is for that text box right here. So as I'm leaving that text box, what I want to do is I want to take what's in that text box and put it inside of that list array. So here is my code to do the items.add, and I'm just going to steal that part of it right there because I'm a lazy typist. Paste it in here, and now what am I going to add into that combo box? I'm going to add what is in that text box that I didn't name yet, textbox1.text. Okay, I'm going to add that into it right there. Now as soon as I add that into it, I want what's in that text box now to disappear. Okay, so I want textbox1.text to be equal to nothing. Okay, and then maybe what I want to do, I'll just leave it like that. I could put my cursor back into that text box, but that might be a problem for the user, meaning I could do a textbox.focus, which sets the cursor back automatically. Let's just see what's going to happen with this guy. So I've already going to have, when I run this, I'll already have dog, cat, horse, cow, and hamster in. I'm going to add something now from the text box. Let's prove that. Okay. Now I might have an issue here, because really the only time I really want to add something is when that text box is filled in here. But let's run this first of all and see what ends up happening. So I'm in that combo box. I have those elements that I hard coded in. Now I'm going to come down here and I'm going to put in pig. I'm simply going to tab out of here. Now when I tabbed out of it, I ended up at the exit button, but I left that object. Watch this. There's my pig. Okay. Chicken. Tab out of it. Boom. It wiped it out, took me down here, and now put chicken within my combo box. Now, a lot of times you're going to find that this is not the way you populate it from a text box to a combo box. More commonly, what you're going to do is read it this way from a database and go back in and tell it to read all of your customer numbers or all your customer names or blah, blah, blah out of your database and populate your combo box so you can pick one of them if you want. But this gives you a pretty good example of how you would add an item in. Let's take a look at how you might want to print an item out. Okay, so next thing I'd like to do here is I'm going to put a button in here. And all I want to do when this button is pressed, and let's go back to our properties here, is I'm going to call this one button list. Okay, and all I want to do is list the elements now that I have stored in that list box. And by the way, when I stopped running the program, those elements are treated like variables. So there's nothing in these combo boxes right now. I mean, when I run it again, I would have to re-add the chicken and that pig, for example, because it was lost. So over here, I think I want to call that button. We're just going to put list items. Okay, and now this is where I can come back in here and I can create a list control, a list object. But in this particular case, the list object is a little bit it's got some issues with it, and that is that the list is going to want to go to the bottom of this page, and I run out of space. Now I could dynamically resize the page, blah blah blah, but I don't want to do that. This list object, in this particular case, may not be the best item for output. And I've always said that text boxes are for input, labels are for output, but there is a time where you're going to want to use a text box for output. And let me show you, this is one of those examples here, because it will do some cool stuff for us. So I'm going to grab a text box here. In fact, I've got one right here. Let's just copy this one and paste it down below. So inside this text box, I want this text box to be like a text region. So what I'm going to do here is, first thing is I'm going to come back over and I'm going to make it a multi-line text box. Okay, so now I can resize it. The advantage now of this is, whereas a label will have to size to show everything, what I can do with this text box now is I can come back in here and I'm going to make it act like a label. So I'm going to come back over to the read only right here and set that to true. Now by me making that read only, it means that you can't edit the information in it. It really, in essence, makes it act like a text box. But the next thing that I'd like to do is find my scroll bars here. And there they are right here. And I have no scroll bars set up, but I know if I put more information in that can be seen in this text box region, I want to scroll up and down, kind of like that list did that we had just a minute ago. So let's go ahead and do that. I want this one to have a vertical scroll bar. So you see how it works up and down? Now, let's go back out here, and this is where we're going to learn something new. I'm going to double click on this list items. So when I click this button, I want something to happen. I want it to read the elements that are inside of this, or if they were, for example, in a list. So keep in mind, what I'm going to show you now doesn't matter whether it's a ListBox or a ComboBox or it's that list array. What I'm going to do now will show you how you can print the items out in that array, or access those items, if you will. Okay, so this is called text box 2, just because I should have done it before. I'm going to name this text output. Okay. Now I'm going to come back to this list item. I'm going to double click on it and get into the code behind. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to create what's called a ForEach loop. Watch this. If I do for and I type ForEach and I hit the tab twice, it's going to build the structure of the ForEach loop for me. And notice what it does. It says for each item that's in a collection, and it wants to know the data type. So in this case, we're going to be dealing with what kind of collection. It's a collection of these animals that I have up here, right? Where's that collection coming from? Well, it's coming from ComboBox.items. Had I had a list out there and named that list my list, it would be coming from my list. But in this case, it's coming from ComboBox.items, and items is what has all of the different items in it. We saw that a minute ago when I pointed to items. It said, when I ran the program, let's just do that one more time just to prove it. Let's put a stop there. Let's rerun it. It's going to stop down below on that stop right here at some point when it decides to do its thing. Oh, there's an error in here. Where's my error at? Oh, I haven't coded this. Let me comment this out first. Now let's go back in and rerun this guy. So he stopped on that line down below. He's running. If I point right now to items, okay, and I go down into it, it tells me that there's 5 items in that list. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 items in that list. So this right here represents the array, or the list array, if you will, that we want to get to. So let's stop the program. I'm going to take that stop out right here. Give me some territory at the bottom. And now what I want to do is let's uncomment all this stuff here. And I want to say and let me explain how the ForEach works. The ForEach says you got this locker, this set of lockers, and you're going to grab one locker out of that big stack of lockers at a time. So the collection represents the stack of lockers, and what this item says is for every row or every locker inside this collection, call it item. So when I want to get to each individual element of that array, it's going to be called item when I get down here, at least the way it defaults right now. So let's change that around just a little bit here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this code right here, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to come down, oops, let's try that again. Right click, Copy, and I'm going to paste that right here for the collection name, because that is the collection right there. Okay. Now I'm going to be reading strings, and I want to get, each time I grab one of those lines out, what do I want to call it? I'm going to call it, I call it anything I want, but I'm going to call it my critter. Okay. So now, by the time it gets here, each time it loops through, it's going to grab from that stack one of those items, and it's going to call it my critter down below. And what I want to do is put that back into that text output. So here's, I start off with my output, so it's going to be text output.text is going to be equal to, now I'm adding on to what it is. I'm saying grab an element, put in text output. Grab the next element, put it in text output. What I have to do is I have to build on text output. If I simply came back in here and said text output is equal to critter, right, like that, oops, critter, or excuse me, my critter right here, it would, every time it loops through it, the only thing it would do is at the end it would show me hamster, because each time it would erase what's in text output. So what I really want to do is I want to say take what's in text output, take the previous text output you had, now add critter to it. And at the end of that, now I actually have to tell it to do a carriage return. So I'm going to add into the end of this an environment.newLine. And the environment.newLine just basically does a carriage return at the end of each statement. So again, I want to back up and explain before we run this what's happening. As I fill in this combo box, no matter how many items I have in it, when I hit that button, it's going to look at all the items that I've typed in, that I've added, like this up here, and it's going to put it at that spot. Now when I run this string, every time it loops through here, it's going to grab one item out of that list, and it's going to call it my critter right there. And then down below, that's all I got to do to get to my critter. Let's prove this is working. Let's run it. It's always great to talk about it, but it's always best to prove it. Okay, so if I do that combo box right now, I've got it all the way down to hamster. Let's go back in and add an item in here. So I'm going to add in a hamster. I'm going to add in a wolf. Okay, I'm going to tab out of it. I'm going to add in a tiger. Now notice my case, how I type it in. I'm going to tab out of it. Okay, if I list it, there's my wolf and my tiger right there. Now if I come down here and say list items, boom, notice the combo box did for me. Isn't that cool? So this is basically a lead-in to your homework. The things that we've looked at in here that are pretty important, first of all, are to understand that when these objects exist over here on this toolbar on the left-hand side, these are little programs that somebody created. And when you get into the next class, I'll show you how they create these items over here. And you can create your own tool if you want to. But these tools oftentimes are a combination of other tools put together. Remember, we talked about that in that Geek Speak document. If I add something, so if I've got a text box and I decided I want to add a feature that doesn't exist to it, that's called extending an object. But if I want to change an existing feature, meaning that I want to change the text that defaults to black maybe to red, then that's called overwriting on it. And that's what we'll talk about that more next quarter. But the thing about this is understand the ListBox, to understand the combo box, where the items come from, how to put items into it. So you understand the list object itself. We then went back in and realized that that list object is built into this combo box. We looked at that specifically. Then we went back into our code and we talked about how do you add items in. And I showed you, in fact, this is going to be very almost identical to your homework, folks. So you're going to want to watch this and recreate much of this on your own. But here's how I added items back in. I could add it by hand. This is how you added it by hand. If I knew the literal, I'm just adding a hamster in here. But this allows me down here to go back in and use the same method, ComboBox1 items.add. See how it is? But to add what's in that existing text box and then erase what's in that text box after it's been added in one time. And then down below here, we added in this button that says when I click this button, I want the list to appear. We talked a little bit about multi-line text boxes and how to create scroll bars and how to make it act like a label. And before I go on, let me show you why it's important. If I go back and I check this guy right here, and I tell it that it's not, let's see here, read only, right here, change it back. Let me show you what the issue would be here. And it's probably not a big deal at this moment, but it could be. So if right now I've got those items that are in here and I want those listed out, I could actually come back in here and type whatever I want in here. And I could fictitiously produce output. And you don't want the user, now in this case it's not a big deal, but in other cases it might be a big deal if you're doing numeric output. You don't want fictitious output to be displayed within your text box. But you also want to have the ability to scroll up and down, which is not what you get out of a label. So to make that work, I simply went back in and made that object a read-only object. That way you cannot edit it any longer. So when I list these items out, okay, I can't go in here as I'm typing and put anything in it. So hopefully this made sense to you folks. These are easy objects to deal with and extremely powerful, especially when we start talking in another class about reading those elements out of a database and plugging them into our ComboBox. That's where we get really powerful. And that technology that we're going to use later in the Microsoft world is called ADO.net, but I'll leave that to the 256 class later. Thanks, folks.